I was listening to a conversation or discussion, semi-interview, I guess, that Tim Pool was having with Vausch. I hope I'm saying that right. Who is a kind of uh, a real socialist, or at least a left-wing ideologue. I couldn't listen to very much of this conversation because Vausch, the kind of intellectual dishonesty that sort of Vausch is used to peddling, um, I wouldn't say was being adequately engaged with by Tim Pool in order to actually sort of confront and combat it and pin it down. And that was also because of the arrangement that Tim Pool has. He's got, I guess, a friend of his at the discussion table, and the kind of ideological clash that you need to have with Vaush needs to be quite pointed. And having a third wheel in a discussion really just lends itself too conveniently into Vaush's sophistry and casuistry that he can sort of use that break in the cadence to essentially get away with his nebulous, convoluted, sort of scuffing up the issue and to keeping the simplistic, overarching, sort of framing of the issue that allows him to get away. Now, the reason why Vaush loves identity politics, essentially, although he complains that it's incorrect in how it's applied by most people who are supposedly proponents of it in corporations and things like that. But the reason why he likes it ideologically is because it's part of a school of almost ethical or moral thinking, which has at its premise a kind of a command economy of a top-down approach to managing and administering society. So it's ethically compatible with socialism. That's essentially the only reason why Vaush likes it, is because it has the same view of society, it has the same conceptualization of society as any sort of authoritarian regime needs to operate. Um, it has the same kind of substantiation for its kind of interventionist, top-down interventionist control of society. Um, so it's morally compatible essentially, and it promotes the conceptualization of society into a convenient rubric which is compatible with his form of politics. So that's essentially why he likes it. Um, Now, this got me thinking about exploring some of the general political and economic themes. Now, I mean, if Vaush is listening to this, which I'm sure he never will, but if he is, I mean, I consider myself to be a species of Marxist, but I'm a very different Marxist to, I'm not a revolutionary socialist or something like that. I believe that capitalism does need to be overcome, but that it should not be overcome using the government. It should be overcome with a private um, augmentation. That if you want to live in a space, in a community that no longer cares to involve itself with economic internal uh, structure, then you have to have the responsibility to take control of reality and to engineer such a thing. That it's not just one revolution away and then it's going to be top down imposed. If I mean we live in such a um, there's so much liberal democratic freedom available to people that it's really good enough to just have, let's say, even a classical liberal type of capitalistic default situation where you can essentially group up with other people and buy your freedom from the market. Never has revolution had so little obstacles to it. Before, people had to fight against kings and monarchs in order to gain some kind of political independence. We already have political independence in the individual. The lack of manifestation and pursuit of that promise and that hope is really a um, a moral deficit and a practical deficit or a pragmatic deficit uh, that can be levied against the individual. Um, the idea that you should just be able to demand and cry out for some kind of systemic justice, and then some kind of authority needs to provide it for you, is I mean, you can see why it leads into the kinds of depravity and like when you try to have any kind of so-called socialism that isn't premised in libertarian values, you are courting a recipe for an utter disaster, because you can easily just scapegoat and the blame in why your accounting doesn't add up, into why your society is not functioning or whatever. You can always just paint a new target on some boogeyman or scapegoat, for not conforming into the grand enlightened plan, because there's no sense of responsibility and there's no sense of building it from the ground up. Um, so Vaush is of that kind of morally deficit form of so-called Marxism. And I mean, I would say that, yes, I mean, I would not be called an orthodox Marxist. Somehow Leninism falls under the category of orthodox Marxists. So, I mean, I don't even understand, how they've even categorized their political philosophies. But, these are very dishonest intellectuals. I mean, I can go on into the other kind of philosophical problems which are laden into their worldview, but Kantian institutions have the same kind of paradox, where, anyway, I'm not gonna go into that tangent, but okay, I want to talk politically, I guess, in the modern era, the kinds of, let's say, dishonest pseudo intellectualism that people like Vaush are prone to exploiting. And this, I mean, might not include Vaush particularly on these particular counts of these particular forms of argument, but essentially to understand capitalism, and look, I understand that capitalism does have problems, but I do think that if people were actual Marxists, they wouldn't mind capitalism actually failing on its own merits, rather than this kind of oligarchical plutocracy that we inhabit today, which is, I don't think we can honestly say that this is capitalism. And I do think that the transition from capitalism to something else doesn't have to be motivated by extreme collapse. It could just be motivated by, well, someone actually has a working model of something other than capitalism. Let's just transition to that because it's a more harmonious and it's a better system overall. The biggest problem that I see in any transition away from capitalism is, essentially, you could call it a kind of a cultural problem. And in that way, there are these sort of, there's the school of thinking that comes from these sort of Italian Marxists who are ended up sort of being fascists, and they basically predicted identity politics would be the kind of the end of the road for the Marxist hypothesis, and then you would kind of precipitate a fascist ethnocentrism or something like that, as the core structure of a socialistic, of some form of socialism, which in some sense, I mean, even all the totalitarian left and right, what they all seem to eventually do is create an ideological narrative of some kind of boogeyman, so that they can get this feeling that they're constantly progressing against something, um, which I think is psychologically unsustainable. So I do think that there is this psychological missing piece of the puzzle, which is why I've devoted my whole life to understanding personality theory and the structure, the deep structure of psychology. But anyway, I'm not going to talk about that here. But and not taking responsibility for these kinds of issues, which cannot just be baked into a top-down structure. It's not going to happen. and ideological narratives are essentially going to exacerbate this problem. You're just going to create a powder keg of um, of sort of magical thinking, of a kind of group psychosis, but also a kind of collective psychopathy, which you can see even within the kind of, you could call it the emotional presentation of people like Vausch. You can see the kind of, the soft spokenness, which is quite a superficial shell for something that is, quite capable of being exceedingly sinister, underlying that it's almost like this, I'm a candidate for the golden shadow. Allow people to project um, their vision of an enlightened and evolved human being onto me. Like I am the proto uh, container for a new political dispensation or something like that. And as I say, the biggest flaw in all of this is that it just completely undermines libertarian um, culture and a libertarian psychological structure as well, I would probably say. But okay, let me move on to the point. I mean, Noam Chomsky has also now, in his dotage, he has also fallen prey to what I would call this Marxist fascistic sort of convolution. Um, I mean, Noam Chomsky, I think, did point out, let's say, the right caveats about identity politics, but these are caveats which identity politics has no ability to adhere to. That there's no way to have an identity politics that isn't corrosively undermining of other people's identity chauvinism. I mean, the whole value of identity politics is that it essentially disguises identity chauvinism as a form of a means to an end of achieving equality, and it's but if you, I mean, that's just the window dressing. I mean, it's really indistinguishable from Nazi philosophy. It just inverts the two prime values. I mean, the Nazis also believed in equality. They also believed in having every ethnicity should have their own ethno-state. That was the vision in Mein Kampf that the Nazis had. They just believed that the point of having that chauvinism was so that you could the point of having that principle of equality was to ensure the purity of the chauvinism, of the ethnocentrism. Um, so their equality was a kind of their principle of equality, their separate but equal version of equality, was essentially there to prime and to undergird the achievement of knowing that one was superior to others or something like that, or in their own unique subjective point of view that was that is just magically shared by everyone in that container or something like that. So this deep sort of cultural relativism. So in some sense, their equality was the handmaiden of cultural relativism, and which is eventually there to facilitate a kind of pure chauvinism, um, or an unadulterated chauvinism rather. Whereas identity politics would really just, it should be called proto-fascism. Um, it just reorders those things. It says identitarian chauvinism is the means to achieving equality, but I mean, all that is just a rearrangement of the window dressing. But the deep structure is and the consequences of that kind of narrative are all the same in consequence. Hitler would have just called these people useful idiots, spreading the conceptualization of society according to the Nazi philosophical categorization and conceptualization of society. So it's the I mean, you had the same kind of progressives marching hand in hand with the Nazis during the Nuremberg dissatisfaction rallies, where they were all together demanding justice for their identity. They wanted to be infantilized by the political arena. And so they've completely denigrated their own, let's say, libertarian, um, there is no consciousness, essentially. So, and Marxism does have this defect as well. It does have a similar defect in the same way that class consciousness, and at least if you're going down the dictatorship of the proletarian route to revolution, you can understand that class consciousness is really just a narrative. It's really just a kind of tautological formula that you believe in it because the conclusions of the narrative are the premises in the narrative. And on that basis, you have a kind of unaccountable political power. Um, that as long as it's following the recipe and as long as everyone says, well, we are on the road to following the recipe, there's no real accountability. Um, Modern Marxists, some sections of modern Marxists say, well, now we have technology, so we don't actually have to have a vanguard of the proletariat. We don't have to have a dictatorship um, structured in that kind of concentration of power. I would go one step further. Well, technology is so great, we don't even have to take over the state. Just do it. Just get on with it without any kind of political bullshit. Just model it. Just make it into existence. You're saying that you can't get enough people to band together to create something. Because, I mean, collectively as a society, you will always have to operate with some built in, let's say, uh, but essentially, what makes wealth is that you invest capital into um, production capacity, essentially, and the the higher rate of capital investment, the more efficient your production is, and obviously, if you're planning an internal economy like this, then you can essentially gear everything towards. I mean, obviously, it wouldn't technically be capitalist, but essentially, what you're trying to do is you're trying to concentrate capital investment so that you can free people from labor. Now, that's what you're doing on the economic side of your society. On the social side of your society, you have to have a culture that is capable of existing without personal bank accounts and some kind of collectivist distribution of resources and goods and services. Now that is, I think, a huge problem. I don't think that um, you know big daddy government or something like that is not the solution to that, especially because that will essentially completely um, it will sort of it will neuter the mind of I mean, eventually the government will take over pedagogy. It will take over education. It will take over culture to an extent to which is not desirable. You need to have culture in the hands of the individual. And this is a very, sort of sophisticated problem, which is more almost psychological. Um, that it cannot be regarded as a sociological concern. It has to be regarded as a psychological concern. And the state of psychology is, at least within the academy, is not at such a level that it can seriously uh, solve that problem. So that is why I have focused on psychology to bring solutions to this problem, because I think that this is the biggest missing puzzle piece into even getting political controversy around these sorts of things correct. But you still have people like Vausch who are, I see them as what are they called? Accelerationists, and this is what I see the left so-called doing, which is is they are trying to undermine a system. They're trying to discredit a system. They're trying to bring it down so that it's weak to a top-down solution. And this, I think, is what sort of this is the kind of the intellectual bad faith and dishonesty which undergirds all of their positions about what to do, is that they are trying to make capitalism look defunct. And I do not believe it is defunct. I think that what is hindering capitalism at the moment is its anti-capitalist structures that it has within itself. And I do think that we would line ourselves up for a better transition in the future if we stabilized it and if we try to clean it up, as it were, against the oligarchical, sort of. And I must say that that oligarchy and those plutocratic elite elements love these kinds of revolutionary ideologies because it's all top-down control. And accountable politics, so you can get away with back deal deals in the back room and such like that. Okay, anyway, so let me talk about White's law. So what we are generally suffering from is what Eric Weinstein calls ego obligations, or the embedded growth obligations. Um, I'm not going to talk about his conception of it. I'm just going to talk about White's law. So White's law states that a society is as wealthy as the cost of energy per capita. And from the 70s, we can realize that after cheap oil, the cost of energy has been steadily increasing. So in real terms, adjusted for inflation, the extent to which we pay for energy, we pay for gasoline or petrol to put in a car, we pay for electricity from the grid. The cost of electricity, the cost of energy, everything is run on energy, is going up. So as the cost of energy goes up, society gets poorer. Now, the only way to ameliorate this inevitable, let's say, this inevitable local economic fact, and when I say local, I mean that this has been the inevitable truth from the 70s, after cheap oil sort of came to an end or whatever, or so the cost of energy has been going up. Now, the only way to make up for this and to satisfy White's law, which also, as the ego in Eric Weinstein describes, has a kind of addictive thing to it, because when energy is getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper year on year on year, or decade after decade after decade, society gets used to the fact that it is going to have more to exploit. It's used to the fact that it gets comfortable with a rate of accelerated increase. It's not even that it gets used to growth, it gets used to accelerated growth. And that gets built into the expectation in terms of living standards and things like that. And it allows for a certain level of plutocratic, so that the plutocrats can take an increasing growth of their investments in some sense, or of their positions, while there is still growth left over for everyone else. So you can kind of have a happy plutocracy and a happy, let's say, real underlying economy when you've got that kind of accelerated growth. Now, when you start having negative growth on the level of this kind of societal wealth, as I've described it, as energy available per capita, all of that goes away, and then you actually have a fight between the plutocrats and the real economy, or something like that. And even if the real economy wins the fight, perhaps you're managing decline on some level as well. Now, also the way to make up for this is efficiency. That if you can do more with the same energy, in some sense, you have increased your if you can use the energy better, more efficiently, then in some sense you've scaled your access to energy. So efficiency is actually very important. So now, when these socialists have plugged into carbon emissions, and I must say, I hate the whole carbon dioxide climate change obsession. I think it's completely crazy. I do think that there are huge environmental problems. I do think CO2 is not an environmental problem. The environmentalism of the 90s. See, carbon dioxide is not even a pollutant. Carbon dioxide is not pollution. But because we have completely obsessed ourselves with this natural part of the carbon cycle, because of some crazy bogus theories about exponential warmth, when we should be warming. If you understand the history of climate, you understand where we are, in terms of exactly where we are coming out of an interglacial, or coming into uh, the interglacial period properly, after just coming out of the little ice age. Um, it's crazy to think that that carbon dioxide of all gases is going to be the driver of the change of our climate. I mean, it's so unscientific. It's so unsupported by, you have to ignore so much evidence in order to make that claim. It's alarmist fear mongering. And it's probably politically motivated as well. I mean, when you start giving money to people based on their research in climate change, you've just created a perverse incentive to create a false confirmation, and that's so we've um, created a market for bad scientific investigation, and everyone intelligent that has an independent mind that actually looks at this stuff, especially even the people who invented the computer modeling which is used for this stuff, says that it's all bogus. So you really have to. It's a captured industry at this point, but never mind. I mean, there's a lot to say about this, but you just look at the glacial core samples. Temperature in some sense, the only reason why our temperature has been so constant is because of the little ice age. Earth temperature is actually much more volatile. I mean, we even know this in human history. We know this because, the Egyptians had a huge environmental disaster. They used to be, the Nile, the breadbasket of Rome. Egypt was the breadbasket of Rome, and that just came to an end. You know, environmental transitions and variance is, I mean, and certainly the failure of Egyptian agriculture had nothing to do with human produced climate change. So like, change in climate is the norm. It's not, and so because we've got some volatility um, now, and you're going to attribute that to some crazy theory about carbon dioxide. I mean, it's actually laughable. And I can't even believe how many intellectuals fall for this, just because, you got a pile of convoluted, contrived papers on the issue, and and you haven't even thought about any of the stuff from first principles, from taking a clear vision of this, just because you've got this cacophony of people with white lab coats telling you something, and then it can't be challenged. It becomes orthodoxy, it becomes dogma. I mean, it's just, this is why we live in a decadent and declining society, is because journalism is essentially neutered. Anyway, let me not get into tangents. Let me just move on. But so I mean, I see this, that therefore obviously socialists or left wing people want to control carbon emissions because it's conducive to a top down command economy. It's conducive to controlling society. If you can control carbon, you can control everything under that guise, under that uh, I mean, and what's crazy to me is just, environmental degradation is a real problem. We are destroying the ecology in the seas, and we're doing lots of things that are very bad for the planet. But somehow the only thing that we care about is carbon dioxide emissions. I mean, it's a distraction, it's a diversion. And that's what pisses me off the most about it, is that it's, it leads to inefficiency, essentially. So we've got all these forces, um, which in an accelerationist sort of way, people are using to employ more plutocratic, top-down, sort of irrelevant excuses to impose controls and and useless regulation. I mean, there are a lot of, there are a lot of things that could be done that does require some imagination, but we don't have space to think about anything because we're thinking about irrelevant problems. Anyway, and by the way, the fracking is still a problem because just because you might have access to oil and fossil fuels doesn't mean that that access means that it's cheap. Fracking is more expensive. It requires more energy to get that oil out of the ground. So it's already the energy that you're getting from fracking is more expensive essentially. Is another way of putting it. So I just wanted to say that. Uh, yeah. So we've got this White's law, and we have to start getting a politics that's very realistic about trying to ameliorate and try to maximize White's law for the uh, responsible management of and the kind of yeah. So I guess I haven't made very. These are not really arguments. These are just sort of observations and comments. So I'll just say that these people, all of their policy um, preferences, I think, are generally a kind of bad faith accelerationist, sort of investment. It's convenient for them to say, well, climate change is a problem that essentially will only be effectively tackled by a more centralized top-down control. So we might as well start to install a fully planned economy. Um, and it also helps them to sort of always have the wrong sort of this idea that, yeah, let's just demand a higher minimum wage and somehow that will help people that are employed while at the same time destroying an employment opportunity. It's all this weird kind of backwards moralistic thinking because it sort of it helps destroy the thing that they're trying to replace anyway. It helps to discredit the thing that they're trying to replace anyway. Um, and I call this is what I call bad faith Marxism, because if people actually wanted authentic Marxism, if they in some sense wanted to be ideologically coherently accelerationist, they would try to actually maximize capitalism. To they would try to remove minimum wages. Real Marxists would want to remove minimum wages because then we will see what capitalism looks like. So I've always found that their position to be very contrived, and very sort of paradoxical within itself. And then that paradox in in the example that I just sort of gave as well as an example of that paradox, but then is tethered to this tautological narrative about sort of the end justifies the means. I mean, these were not the specific things that I would have raised to Vausch. I'm just talking about this topic much more generally to give an overarching picture of how I see these matters fitting together in the larger scheme. Um, I mean, the thing that you have to raise divorce about identity politics is about, sort of the leveraging of generalizations and how that could ever be a useful way of describing what eventually then becomes an insoluble problem. Or under that framing, it's not possible to tackle um, identitarian concerns. They are these are problems that belong to statistics. They don't belong to real people on the ground. And if you want to know why a real person has a problem, their problem is not a statistic. Their problem is it has to be conceptualized differently. It has to be understood differently in the real world, not in the statistical world. So you've got this kind of um, there's a physics analogy about trying to mix relativistic models of what's going on and quantum models of what's going on. It's different Hilbert space. It just you can't add them together. Um, but anyway, another theme that I spoke to, but which didn't explicitly iterate, is the undermining of meritocracy, essentially, which is also something that capitalism requires, in some sense, in order to have, let's say, a positive cultural edifice, or a moral substantiation of its structure, and which identity politics directly challenges and seeks to undermine. And by enforcing identity politics, in terms of affirmative action or any kind of policy that is taken to fudge the outcomes and not to focus on, because you could have a non-offensive form of affirmative action which didn't demand quotas, but instead targeted recipients of ameliorative, rehabilitative, let's say extra focus. That essentially you would have extra training programs, or essentially you would have like courses for people to take or tutoring for people to have before they went to college or before they took a kind of an exam or an entrance exam or something like that, to try to bridge the gap, as it were, instead of trying to fudge the outcome by changing the standards. So you don't change the meritocratic structure, but what you do is you try to find people that are, let's say, worthy recipients of that, if you want to describe them as being victims of systemic oppression or whatever, but it's actually doing something to fix the systemic oppression directly, and instead of trying to compensate for the systemic oppression. And so, that would be the difference, is actually fixing a real tangible problem and solving it, and having policy that targets generating solutions instead of trying to compensate for the description of something, which is again like relying on an ideological narrative, which is a hypothesis, which is that can never be as Brett Weinstein even describes it. It's like you can't prove or disprove the theory. It's almost it can only ever exist as a kind of general hypothesis, which is a very dangerous thing to have ruling over the moral engine of a society. Is an unprovable hypothesis um, that also uh, uh, perversely incentivizes, projecting racialist intentionality onto everything in a kind of historical. Well, it has so many problems that undermine normative morality and normative ethics and normative values, replacing it with a kind of superficial values. I actually have I wrote something. There was, I'm on this sort of forum. It's not really a forum, but anyway, people. I haven't really been active on this forum before, but the first thing I decided to comment on was someone had created an application and they were wishing to discuss the application. And the application is a kind of service given to businesses to monitor their culture and to sort of discuss possible ways of cultural engineering their own business. And I mean, it's very interesting. So, and this is a bit of a tangent, but I think it has a lot of important things in it. So it's called a culture app. We've developed a culture app to challenge and explore how people think about culture by collecting behavioral data in real time. We are measurably improving strategic priorities such as diversity, inclusion, employee engagement, and speaking up. The example that he gives of this is of sexism or something like that. So let me not just completely malign this culture app. Let me give the example that he gives. So, because I think that the example that he gives of how this app can be used is of a completely different kind to what I've just read in the description, which obviously is very unsettling to me. It's almost like an Orwellian, sort of nightmare of Big Brother and cultural engineering is what I just read. But let me just give the example, because I think the example that he gives shows that there is a niche that could be, I think, morally filled by an app like this. But I think that an app like this, at least in the current climate, will be a very bad thing. It'll be an immoral, a force for corrupted morality. But anyway, it says, put yourself in this scenario. Last night you attended an event with a key client. Towards the end of the event, you noticed one of the client's senior executives touching a colleague inappropriately and making lewd remarks. You didn't step in, but instead interjected yourself into the conversation to diffuse the situation. Did you do the right thing? ? And then, they said we've developed a cultural app to challenge and explore how people think about culture by collecting behavioral data in real time. Yeah, so now, I mean, I'm sympathetic to that kind of example. And I'll just read out what my comment is on this. This app is fundamentally immoral. The only way to have a harmonious culture is when actual values are infused into behavior. Diversity and inclusion are Orwellian doublespeak for an immoral system of superficial and corrupt morality. Non-racialism and non-sexism is the only ethical value system that can ever hope to establish regulated and stable relations with any culture. In brackets, the current diversity and inclusion bunk will invariably devolve into witch hunts and toxicity that will be willfully blind to its own racist projections and prejudiced analyses. These sort of superficial values inexorably lead to means justify the end. I should have said ends justify the means paradoxes that perpetrate and contradict the supposed pure intentions of their own practitioners. This is a bandwagon that is paving the road to hell. Please consider the lack of normative ethics as the first misstep in the kind of cultural solutions that your app is attempting to promote and exacerbate. As the only form of corrective measures that are encouraged, because if you wanted to say that cultural solutions are the only form of corrective measures that are encouraged, this approach is literally the antithesis of seriously considering questions of normative ethical standards. Models of best practice can be refined and debated, in relation to their execution phase, but practices must first be reasoned from first principles, and that prior substance must seriously empower the application of values and reason by the individual. A theory of normative values that can explain an harmonious system of coherent responsibilities. So I'm saying is that, like, normative values and ethics will create a model of a coherent system of responsibilities that actually are harmonious, and not merely aiming to achieve some superficial target like a moral picture which symbolically infers prescriptions, while involving convoluted and fudged moral thinking and paradoxical moral inequities. At one point I want to talk about the example, but anyway, let me just continue reading what I wrote. If you would like to discuss these philosophical issues with me, I am available, but sadly the current popularity of this hysterical moral panic that you are aiming to service is an unsustainable moral fad that is more likely to lead to inflamed identitarian chauvinism, as its morality is so convoluted that by assisting to help arbitrate its internally messy orthodoxy, you are attempting to provide attempting to provide for your clients will result in the pursuit of a fool's errand, owing to the insoluble nature of the ethics promoted by identity politics, in brackets diversity and inclusion in inverted commas. Predictably, this will inevitably lead towards more prescriptions of segregation in order to avoid the complexities cultivated by the immoral thinking in the foundation of the diversity and inclusion being infused into those superficial moral codes. For example, the growing trend to segregate seminars in order to promote a safe space for people of color. There is no end to the infliction of denigrating treatment, which then foments further demands that can only be settled by further measures of preemptive separation and avoidance, or in the alternative, forcing conformity and compliance to dogmatic beliefs and sentiments. In brackets, enforcing a groupthink narrative that is placed beyond question. Sadly, your application is obviously geared to performing either or both of these deplorable ideological functions, both of which are devoid of genuine normative ethics. So the reason why I'm sympathetic to the example that he gives is because, in some sense, the normative values underlying that, you could say, are pretty obvious. People should not be there's a whole chain of normative ethics, which are very easy to describe, that are being broken by such behavior. And then the question is, well, how do you intervene in the most responsible way, or in a way that is promoting efficacy on metrics which don't have anything to do with morality, but have to do with essentially participating in a business or something like that. So that's like a bit of a how to maximize amoral metrics, but still being a moral person, or something like that. Now, that question is fine when the underlying values are clear cut and already sort of in agreement. But that example does not involve how you would deal with disagreements over perhaps more complicated principles and moral thinking. So, okay, anyway, he wrote in response to me, there is certainly not a right or wrong when it comes to culture, which is much more than simply diversity and inclusion. The point is to encourage conversation and active contemplation about morals and ethics within the context of monitoring and growing culture. I'm glad this is a space you're very active in. Whether or not the pursuit of a particular organizational culture to achieve certain ends is in itself immoral is another question. I'm keen to hear your thoughts on this. But ultimately, the app serves as just one tool to benchmark culture. The tool is most valuable when used over time to assess trends. Culture is something which is quite internal to an organization and difficult to objectively measure by reference to external criteria. So, as part of our broader work to coach or grow culture, we always look for ways to encourage continued monitoring and development of internal tools. Those within the organization are often best placed to understand the nuanced changes in culture over time and act on this. So my response to that was, There is a right and a wrong when it comes to culture. Contradicting the normative value system of non-racialism is wrong and will lead to the perverse and self-aggravating consequences that I outlined above. There is perhaps not a right or a wrong when it comes to maximally executing one's properly structured values, as that is a question of pragmatism, art, or tact that might be seeking to achieve some other metric that exists beyond the realm of moral considerations. Strategies and research on best practice in such a context is fine. But a disagreement over values cannot be divided and removed from the need for an entire reasoned system of ethical principles or arbitrating confrontations between competing values or principles. These reasoned ethical structures must be upheld or endorsed transparently so as to invite challenges and maintain a substantiated vindication of moral justification, and cannot be shielded, especially on the grounds that those values are enmeshed in a cultural domain or a space of compulsory participation, which, if it claims to be value-based, would lead to policing which pretends to be infused with superficial values without being accountable for providing a genuine framework of normative ethics. Having such a superficial standard replaces real ethics with a hollowed-out moral picture that conformity and lip service expects as part of its de facto cultural imposition, relying on rules of a projected narrative that dogmatic attestation is demanded from its subjects, of which dogmatic attestation is demanded from its subjects, slightly better grammar, as that narrative subscription comes to replace genuine moral sentiments. Such enforced subscriptions are ironically premised in sexist and racialist narrative thinking, as a worldview becomes demanded by such a superficial and amoral form of culture, I should have said cultural compliance, which gets so invested into Orwellian doublespeak that at some point the demands of the worldview will lead to obtuse and heavy-handed cultural interventions until all normative values and reasonable systems of ethical behavior will have been actively quashed and opposed by cultural engineering. I am proposing culture should be structured using normative values, a robust system of reasoned out ethics. This should be done transparently and then openly defended. Culture cannot be treated like an amoral domain, although some cultural aspects are irrelevant to moral issues and concerns. I say these things slightly warily because at the moment there is a lot of immoral racism passing as responsible and anti-racist measures that pretend to be morally proficient and values-based, but these sentiments are not normative in their moral reasoning and require blind acceptance of assertions which are made on the back of cherry-picked statistics, blanket accusations, as well as historical inheritance. All of these inductive arguments are not commensurate with normative values and are destructive to a culture premised on normative morality. This is the convoluted impetus that leads to a ends justify the means paradox, as justice gets removed from normative ethics, as it's replaced by a superficial picture of morality. I'm afraid your app is seeking to give businesses the tools to enforce conformity to such nebulous and deplorable corruptions of morality. I do not see how you treat the issue of normative ethics in any enlightened way, which is sensitive to the ticking time bomb that is the divisive and distracting moral panic over identity politics, which will generate its own further cultural doom spiral until it's stopped by something that confronts its lack of normative values. Okay, so why did I say all of that? So, I mean, I just, this is a bit of a tangent, but I think it's worth tacking on to this general talking about the undermining of culture and or of the political and cultural structure, but also the economic structure by left-wing people with certain forms of bad faith. And essentially, what it all, I think, boils down to is the undermining of efficiency and essentially the destabilization of the capitalistic edifice, as it were. And I mean that in the ideal sense, because you could say that there's a lot of implicit corruption which is really part of the political and cultural and economic system, which is not really capitalistic, um, which undermines competition and free enterprises and entrenches plutocrats and such. Okay, so getting businesses to endorse essentially the debasement of a meritocracy through identity politics is another form of destroying the cultural foundation of capitalism, but also the foundation of capitalism that makes it efficient, that makes it functional. So it literally renders it, kind of disintegrated. It renders it beleaguered. It renders it dysfunctional. And in that dysfunction and state of dismanagement, it makes it prone to grander claims, grander blanket accusations levied against it that it's a failure, that that we're reaching the end times of capitalism, that capitalism has now reached its mature phase in the Marxist hypothesis. And again, this is I think it shows a lack in the belief of the actual, paradoxically, it shows a lack of belief in the Marxist hypothesis, because they're not willing to actually give capitalism a chance. That everything that is complained about in terms of that capitalism has failed us, um, and in terms of how neoliberalism is almost this poster child of the fact that capitalism is a general collective sort of market failure, is the face of a general sort of market failure, instead of um, delineating specific market failures and addressing them and maximizing the efficacy of the market, or at least giving it a chance to solve a problem without big government interventionism. Um, you know, I mean, I can't help it, because there are special versions of these problems in South Africa which are just absolutely, crazy. Because the functions that the state has, the state can't even perform effectively. The state is so inefficient that it would actually be better to privatize many of the things that the state does, to not have any education department, but instead to just give vouchers to people, because private schooling or some kind of private development of standards would surely be better than, essentially, I mean, South Africa pays a huge amount of money for its education system, and we have a terrible education system, which can only be explained by essentially corruption and you could call it levels of structural corruption as well. And there's no political interest or will to do any of these things. And state-owned enterprises have cost the taxpayer so much money and been such a failure, an ongoing failure, a recurring failure, because they don't want to admit to the fact that the government essentially cannot run things effectively. They cannot run things successfully. Um, and they have avoiding sort of admitting that. Also because these state-owned enterprises are a source for large-scale corruption, or the looting of the state is just at a level um, which disgustingly is propped up by this identity politics, by which often takes the form of this hyper realism, which I can only describe as fascist in its rhetorical description of reality. Essentially, you end up depending wholly on this narrative from identity politics to substitute for actually diagnosing the real problem. It's and if you just want to say, it doesn't matter if the state does something or if the private sector does something. What matters is how efficiently it's done. And if the state cannot do something efficiently, it should not be in the business of it. It would be much better if the state handed out vouchers for the services that it provides so badly at such a high rate of corruption and mismanagement and loss. Because then at least there would be more energy in the system, because there would be less essentially bleeding in the system. There would be less loss, less inefficiency. And I mean, essentially what South Africa suffers from is the fact that the parasite that is the ANC government is much too big for the system to sustain it, while people have this disgusting rhetoric that, oh, neoliberalism has failed. Everything that's gone wrong is proof that neoliberalism has failed. I mean, it the level of self-deception, the level of sort of ideological filtration of reality and willful blindness, in order to facilitate this kind of cherry-picked interpretation is it's that same kind of almost accelerationist opportunism, because essentially they've got a kind of an accountability machine where they can make whoever they want accountable for the problem, which they are themselves exacerbating with their very bad policy prescriptions. Essentially, there's no accountability for poor policy. So yeah, I'm perhaps overly sensitive to this because in my context, it's the most obvious that capitalism and liberal development has never been given a chance. When it was given half a chance, we actually had much better growth. When it was very easy to start, anyone could start a closed corporation. It was incredibly cheap. For essentially $10, you could open a closed corporation and receive limited liability and start a business. And then all those things eventually, the nature of the economy changed essentially, as essentially the ANC government was just focused on its essentially its parasitic relationship to state power. And the kind of the illiberal drive towards, because you have to have big corporations, otherwise there's no one to get bribes from. You have to have big players that are run on licenses. So if you have a decentralized economy that doesn't have red tape, big corporations aren't able to compete against smaller entities that are more efficient. They wouldn't be able to pay bribes because there would be a level of efficiency that would be, as a principle, as a theme within the economy, running everything. And tending towards that kind of arrangement, which is also the arrangement that you need to have small and medium businesses which are actually good at developing people's skills and getting people into work, that has been completely preemptively destroyed essentially. For many reasons. I mean, not just the kind of the strange affirmative action, but also because of the kind of the general financial sort of the badly structured financial conditions which are precipitated by having a state which is such a failure at operating state-owned enterprises. And I've heard Davirud explain how essentially the state has removed all the money from the system that can be borrowed, essentially, that the state has acquired all the lending that is available in some sense because the state is so weak, and that leaves very little for the private sector to be able to borrow money to start enterprises, for instance. But anyway, And so, generally what we suffer from is the fact that just that the ANC government is essentially a parasite, and it's much too large a parasite for the health of the underlying organism, and so we can't really survive. And so instead, what is happening is ideologically, there's an excuse built around this. I mean, it's very interesting to then see, the kind of politics in America, how they are being cornered into going in somewhat the same direction of dysfunction and, sort of just, yeah, I mean, the issue about debt traps and such. Anyway, it's very depressing. But once you sort of become, I mean, I know America does have structural problems with debt in terms of liabilities that are unfunded and such, but solvency, I guess, is one way to essentially accelerate the issue of solvency, or getting into deeper sort of insolvency, is to try to create an incentive to overturn the entire system, which is probably going to precipitate a lot of I mean, who knows, but a lot of chaos, a lot of if you try to switch to a planned economy, I mean, usually the biggest problem is that productive people, the idea that you can just switch an economy into a planned economy, and that you're still going to have people who will be willing to perform the functions that they function in the corporate world under a completely different incentive package, is it's a really sort of irresponsible way of demanding hysterically, under some sort of simplistic narrative of things. Yeah, it really. I mean, these are not what Marxists should be. I mean, Marxists, were originally, at least, they held themselves distinct from utopian socialists and communists. Um, and again, anyway, I'm not going to talk about my vision of a transitionary system, but anyway, but sadly, it looks like that. Ironically, what is more likely to happen under these sorts of pressures of having a planned economy is something like the precipitation, the inadvertent precipitation of a kind of some species of fascism. But I mean, in some sense, it's hard to describe how fascism is that different from state capitalism or Leninism. It just has essentially different window dressing. But it looks like that we're more likely to go the way of fascism if identity politics is in the picture. and that kind of racialist consciousness, which is described as the solution, as the appropriate means to arrive at the end. Anyway, okay, I guess I'm just going to stop this recording. Didn't get to any sort of neat points, but I've said a lot of these things before in other recordings.